The winter of 1943 pressed upon the earth like a clenched fist. The Eastern Front stretched endlessly, a scar of ice and smoke that divided empires, men, and the idea of mercy itself. Villages had ceased to be villages. They were now coordinates, frozen markers in a war that swallowed everything it touched. Beyond one such village, a scattering of ruined huts and a church tower without its bell, a soldier stood watch. His name, like so many lost to time, was never recorded. Only the record of what he did remained. He had been part of a platoon that once numbered 43. They were assigned to guard an ammunition post, a few crates of mortar shells, 2 machine guns, and a radio that rarely worked. The ground was frozen so hard it cracked underfoot, like old bone. At night, the world disappeared beneath snow and silence. By day, smoke curled from the east, where the front lines shifted like restless ghosts. The soldier did not speak much. The cold made words unnecessary. It was enough to breathe, to watch the horizon, and to wait. The attack came without warning, as most on that front did. It was not an army that approached, but a storm of men. German infantry supported by armored carriers. Their advance was slow but inevitable, like the grinding of iron through frost. The soldiers' unit had been told reinforcements would come within a day. But in war, a day could mean forever. When the first shells landed, the forest lit up like a funeral pyre. Branches shattered, snow turned black with smoke. The men fired until their rifles burned hot in their hands. But by nightfall, only 6 were left. The commander, a man whose face had long forgotten what rest looked like, gave the order to fall back to the village. The soldier, standing nearest the gun emplacement, nodded but did not move. Someone had to hold the line, if only for a while. He told the others to go. They hesitated, then went. By dawn, he was alone. The snow fell heavier, erasing the footprints that led away from the outpost. The silence that followed was almost sacred. Only the wind remained, whispering through the ruins like the last prayer of the living. He checked the machine gun, loaded the last of the ammunition belts, and stacked grenades within reach. His fingers were numb, but his mind was clear. In war, clarity was not courage. It was necessity. From the ridge, he could see the German formation moving again, a gray tide rolling across the white earth. Trucks, soldiers, and the faint glimmer of steel helmets advancing in disciplined rhythm. 300, maybe more. He exhaled, breath turning to fog, and waited. The first volley came at dawn. Rifle fire cracked through the cold. He returned it, each shot measured, deliberate. From his position, he could see men falling, others ducking behind cover. He changed positions often, firing from one trench, then another, making it seem as though many were defending, not one. By midday, smoke covered the field. His coat was torn, face streaked with grime and sweat frozen in the cold air. The radio crackled once, static, then silence. When a German unit flanked his position, he pulled the pin from a grenade and waited until he could see their eyes. The explosion sent snow and blood into the wind. He crawled to another foxhole, dragging his rifle, his heartbeat steady. Hours turned into an eternity, measured only by the rhythm of fire and silence. By evening, they surrounded him. But the fog had begun to roll in from the forest, thick as smoke, swallowing sound and sight. He used it as cover, firing short bursts, retreating deeper into the trenches, making it seem as though there were dozens still alive. That night, the forest glowed faintly from burning wrecks. The German forces pulled back to regroup. He leaned against a wall of frozen mud, eyes half closed, and listened to the wind move through broken trees. He had held the outpost for 12 hours, alone. But the night was not over. From the east, Faint and distant came the sound of artillery. Soviet guns, perhaps a mile or two away. Reinforcements. Hope was a dangerous thing, but in that frozen graveyard, it was all he had left. He reloaded his rifle and waited for dawn. When morning came, it did not bring light, only a gray half-dawn that seemed to rise from the snow itself. The fog had thickened overnight, swallowing the ridgeline and blurring the horizon into a single cold breath. The soldier stirred where he had slept, if one could call it sleep, half buried in a trench, his coat stiff with frost, his hands blackened from soot and gunpowder. The air smelled of iron and burnt oil. The battlefield around him was a wasteland of silence. The frozen bodies of men and machines lay scattered in the white expanse, faintly steaming where warmth still clung to them. Crows circled high above, black flecks against the pallid sky. He listened. Nothing. And then a sound, distant at first, like the roll of thunder. But thunder did not come from the east in winter. It grew, slow and steady, until the earth itself began to hum. Engines. They were coming again. He rose, shoulders aching, every muscle screaming with fatigue. He checked his ammunition, a single belt for the machine gun, 6 rifle rounds, 3 grenades. It would have to be enough. He moved with the practiced quiet of someone who had long learned that noise invited death. Crawling from trench to trench, he reset the gun on a new ridge of snow, its metal biting cold into his palms. From there, he could just make out the faint shapes of German vehicles moving through the fog. The second attack began at dawn's edge. It came not as a charge, but as a hunt. Soldiers fanned through the mist, advancing in cautious groups, rifles raised. They expected resistance. They did not expect one man. When the first silhouette appeared, the soldier fired. Short, controlled bursts that cracked through the fog, like the snapping of ice. 2 men fell, then 4. The rest ducked, shouting orders in clipped German. He shifted position again, fired from another angle, then another. His aim was not random, each shot placed to suggest a defensive line rather than a single hand. He had turned deception into a weapon sharper than steel. Mortar rounds began to fall. The ground heaved beneath him, snow and soil thrown into the air. He felt the concussion in his chest. The world narrowed to flashes of fire and the thud of impact. He waited through the bombardment, lying still as the dead. When the shelling stopped, the Germans advanced again, believing the position destroyed. That was when he struck. A single grenade rolled down the slope toward them. Then another. Explosions tore through the white fog, and men fell screaming into the drifts. He moved again, limping now, half blind from the smoke. His rifle was nearly empty. The machine gun jammed twice, but he forced it to life with a blow from his frozen fist. By midday, the fog began to lift, revealing a field littered with broken forms. The German line faltered, regrouped, then pulled back. He had held again. For the first time since dawn, the soldier let himself breathe. The stillness that followed was almost unbearable. The kind of quiet that comes only after too much noise. He sat against the wall of the trench, hands shaking, eyes half-closed. His heartbeat echoed louder than the guns had. Somewhere far behind him, artillery rumbled again. The Soviets were still fighting miles away, unaware that one of their own still lived here, holding a ruined line that no longer mattered. The sun broke briefly through the clouds, pale and weak. Its light fell across his face, revealing a boy's jaw beneath the grime. Young, impossibly young. He thought of the men who had left the night before, of their voices fading into the forest. He wondered if they had made it, if they believed him dead. He wondered if, by surviving, he was simply postponing the inevitable. But there was no room for wonder in war. He drank the last of his melted snow water, tightened his belt, and climbed once more to the ridge. The smoke of burning machines drifted eastward. Beyond it, he saw shapes moving. Fresh reinforcements, perhaps another wave. He did not curse. He did not pray. He simply reached for another belt of ammunition and set the gun in place. In the frozen heart of the Eastern Front, where the world had long since forgotten the warmth of peace, one soldier prepared to fight again, alone, unseen, and unyielding. Evening came not as a sunset, but as a slow dimming of the light, as if the sky itself had grown weary of watching men die. The snow had turned gray from soot and ash, and every breath of wind carried the faint, metallic scent of blood. The soldier crouched behind the wreckage of a half-destroyed gun carriage. His hands were raw, his coat torn. His rifle hung by a strap, barrel scorched black. He had not eaten since the previous morning. Hunger had become as constant as the cold. All around him, silence. No movement in the valley. No sound but the wind sighing through shell holes. He knew better than to believe it meant safety. War had a way of going quiet before it screamed. He cleaned the barrel of his weapon with a torn piece of cloth, his fingers clumsy from frostbite. Then he checked the grenades. 2 left, both rusted around the pin. He set them beside him, within reach. The last belt of ammunition lay in his lap. The metal glinted faintly in the fading light. Each cartridge felt heavier than the one before. He looked out toward the frozen horizon. In the far distance, faint black shapes moved. Trucks, half-tracks, men. The Germans were regrouping. They would come again, before dawn. He took a long breath and let it frost in the air. Behind him lay the remains of his post. A cluster of sandbags, a splintered wooden crate, and a dead comrade whose name he no longer remembered. He had covered the man's face with a scarf earlier that morning. In war, respect was a luxury rarely afforded, but he gave what he could. The cold deepened. Ice gathered on the edge of his lashes. The wind keened through the broken trench, sounding almost like a voice. The memory of all those who had fallen here before. He lit a cigarette with trembling hands. The flame flared, briefly, illuminating his face, sharp, hollow, eyes darkened by exhaustion, yet still alive with that strange clarity men find only when death is near. Then, faintly, he heard it. The crunch of boots on snow. He dropped the cigarette, crushed it beneath his glove, and pressed his cheek to the frozen dirt. The sound came again. Not many. Maybe a scout patrol. He waited until they were close. 30 meters, 20, then pulled the pin of the first grenade and lobbed it low. It exploded with a heavy, muffled thud, throwing snow into the air. Shouts followed, startled, panicked. He opened fire, each shot measured, deliberate. Figures dropped into the snow one by one, disappearing into the fog. Then silence again. He stayed still for a long time, listening. Somewhere in the dark, a wounded man moaned. The sound was faint, fading. Then, nothing. The soldier reloaded, one bullet at a time. His fingers bled where the skin had cracked open from cold. Above him, the stars began to appear, pale, distant, uncaring. Hours passed. The moon rose. The wind changed direction. He thought of his home, a small village far to the north, a mother waiting by a stove that had long gone cold, a field that would never be plowed again. He thought of his father, who had gone to fight another war and never returned. He wondered if courage was inherited, or if it was simply the last thing a man has when everything else is gone. Sometime past midnight, the attack came. It began with flares, thin arcs of white light rising into the sky, turning night into a ghostly day. Then the roar of engines, The bark of orders, the first machine gun burst. He answered with fire of his own. The muzzle flash painted his face gold and red. The machine gun rattled, steady and unbroken. They came in waves, 3, maybe 4. He lost count. His hands blistered from the heat of the gun. The belt ran dry, and he switched to his rifle. When that emptied, he threw the last grenade. The night became a blur of sound, explosions, cries, the relentless crack of gunfire echoing through the valley. When the final echo faded, he found himself alone again. The ground was littered with shadows. Smoke coiled in the frozen air like the breath of ghosts. He slumped back against the wall of the trench. His chest burned. His vision swam. He had no ammunition left, no strength to move. Only the faint, rhythmic beat of his heart, stubbornly refusing to stop. And so he sat there, through the long hours until morning, a lone figure amid the ruins of war, one soldier against 300, holding a line no one would remember, in a place no one would visit again. Morning came reluctantly. The sky turned from black to gray, then to the pale white of snowlight, the kind that reveals everything and forgives nothing. The battlefield stretched silent and still, frozen in its own memory. Smoke drifted from burnt trucks. The barrels of rifles jutted from snowbanks like gravestones. Somewhere far off, a single engine coughed, then fell quiet. The war, for this small piece of land, was over, at least for a while. He was still alive. The soldier stirred, stiff and half-buried under frost. His breath came shallow, each inhale painful, a reminder that he had outlasted the night. His machine gun lay beside him, its barrel warped from heat, its metal crusted with ice. He tried to stand and nearly fell. His legs refused him, trembling from exhaustion and cold. He leaned against a frozen sandbag wall, staring blankly at the horizon. The world seemed unreal, washed of color, emptied of sound. The dead surrounded him, sprawled in awkward silence. German helmets half covered by snow, rifles frozen in mid-fall. His own comrades, what few had remained, lay deeper in the trench, still and peaceful, as if asleep. He took a slow step, then another, and made his way toward the edge of the ridge. From there, he could see how far he had held. The valley below was scarred by craters, the forest line blackened from shell fire. Yet, beyond that, faintly, distantly, the red banners of his own army fluttered in the wind. He had done it. He had held the position long enough. For hours he sat on the ridge, unable to move. The cold no longer bit. It simply existed. He watched the snow fall gently onto the wreckage, covering the horrors of the night, as though the world itself wished to forget. When the first Soviet patrol arrived, they did not believe what they saw. They found him half-conscious beside the gun, his coat torn, his face gray, surrounded by the bodies of nearly 300 enemies. At first, they thought he was dead. Then his hand moved, barely, as if brushing away a dream. They carried him down from the hill, whispering to each other in disbelief. The officer leading the patrol paused beside the frozen machine gun and stared. "One man," he murmured. No one answered. By the time they reached the field station, word had already begun to spread. A soldier had stood alone through the night, holding the line against impossible odds. Some called it madness. Others called it heroism. In the weeks that followed, fragments of the story reached the front. Letters carried it from trench to trench, each retelling bending the truth slightly. Some said he had fought for 12 hours, others for 24. Some said he killed 300, others said 500. The numbers didn't matter. What mattered was the message. One man had refused to fall. When he awoke days later in a field hospital, he did not ask what medals he would receive. He asked if the village beyond the valley still stood. It did. He closed his eyes and turned away, his face expressionless. For him, victory was not triumph, but survival. And survival was merely another kind of endurance. He spent the rest of that winter in recovery, his hands wrapped in bandages, his lungs scarred by smoke. The doctors called him lucky. He did not agree. He called himself alive. And that, in war, was rare enough. In spring, the snow melted and the dead were buried. The ridge where he had fought was marked with a small wooden post. No grand monument, no carved stone, just a simple board with a name burned into it by a medic's lighter. When asked later about that night, he said very little. "I did what I was told," he said. "I stayed. That was all." Years would pass. The front would move westward, the war would end, and peace, if one could call it that, would return. But on maps, that ridge would be remembered by a new name: the Line of One. Decades passed. The world changed. The roar of artillery became a memory, and the fields where men had once fought turned green again. Villages were rebuilt, children were born, and the sound of trains replaced the sound of guns. Yet somewhere, deep in the forests of the Eastern Front, the earth still held its secrets. Rusted helmets lay buried beneath moss. Shattered rifles rested in shallow graves. And on one quiet hill, where snow still fell heavier than anywhere else, the remnants of a single trench remained. Few remembered the exact battle. Even fewer knew the name of the man who had stood there. But the locals had a legend. They spoke of a soldier who refused to leave his post, who fought through the night when everyone else had fallen. Every spring, when the last snow melted, children would climb the hill and find fragments of metal, twisted shell casings, a piece of a belt buckle, the corner of a canteen. They would carry them home and ask their grandparents about the war, and the elders would always answer the same way. "There was one man here. He didn't run. That's why the village still stands." In an archive years later, a historian came across a faded field report. The ink had run. The paper smelled faintly of smoke. It was dated February 1943. It read, "Position held by single infantryman after company loss. Enemy assault repelled. Estimated enemy casualties, 300 plus. Soldier recovered alive. Name, unreadable." The historian traced the coordinates to a small hill near the Volga Bend. He went there one winter, camera in hand, walking through drifts that reached his knees. The forest was silent. He found nothing but the wooden post, long decayed, its inscription worn away by time. He took a photograph, a black-and-white image of snow, sky, and the faint outline of what might once have been a bunker. He published it in a small journal under the title, "The Line of One." The image spread quietly, not viral, not famous, but quietly, like an ember passed from one pair of hands to another. Veterans saw it and remembered. Teachers used it to explain courage. Parents showed it to their children. Years later, a museum curator built an exhibit around that photograph. He gathered letters, uniforms, and relics from the same front. In the corner of the display, he placed a single machine gun, its metal pitted and blackened. Beside it, a plaque read, "Anonymous Soldier, Eastern Front, 1943, held position alone, saved his company, survived." Visitors often stood in front of it in silence. They would stare at the weapon, at the scratches on its grip, at the bullet marks that scarred its barrel. Some would whisper, Others would simply bow their heads. It was said that once an old man came to see the exhibit. He wore a faded uniform and carried a wooden cane. He stood there a long time, his hand trembling on the glass, his eyes misted not with pride, but with sorrow. When a young guide approached and asked if he had known the man who fought there, the old man smiled faintly and said, "No one knew him. That was his strength." Then he turned and left without another word. Outside, snow began to fall, soft, slow, the same as it had on that night so long ago. For the rest of the world, the soldier became a symbol, not of violence, but of endurance, not of victory, but of steadfastness. He had fought not to conquer, but to hold a piece of earth, a line in the snow, a promise that some things must not be given up. Generals had their monuments. Cities had their parades. But the nameless soldier had something rarer, the quiet immortality of a story that would not die. Even now, on cold nights when the wind moves through the birch trees, villagers say you can still hear the faint echo of gunfire on the hill, not as thunder, but as memory. A single man's stand, stretched across time. No medals, no graves, no name, just the line he held, and the silence that followed.